In the middle years of the Pacific War, a quiet pattern began to emerge, one that did not announce itself with the clash of fleets or the sinking of flagships. Japanese ships were disappearing without ceremony. Tankers burned alone under empty skies. Cargo vessels vanished between ports. There were no decisive naval battles to explain these losses. No single catastrophe to mark the moment. Yet slowly, relentlessly, Japan's lifeline across the Pacific was being cut. For decades, Japanese planners had believed the empire's fate would be decided at sea. The Imperial Navy, once among the most formidable in the world, embodied that belief. Its carriers and battleships were symbols of control, its doctrine rooted in the expectation of a climactic surface engagement. As long as the fleet survived, Japan assumed its vast maritime empire from the oil fields of Southeast Asia to the factories of the home islands would remain secure. What followed was an irony few had anticipated. The ships were not being destroyed by enemy fleets, but by aircraft often far from any naval confrontation. American bombers, operating from newly captured island airfields, began to range farther across the Pacific. They hunted not warships, but commerce, oil tankers, troop transports, merchant freighters. These were unglamorous targets, rarely mentioned in communiques, yet they carried the fuel, food, and raw materials that sustained the war. At first, the scale of the damage was misunderstood. Sinkings were recorded as isolated incidents, accidents of war. But by 1943 and into 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Strategic air power was achieving what surface fleets could not. Japan's shipping losses mounted faster than they could be replaced. Oil failed to reach refineries. Factories slowed. Warships remained afloat, but increasingly immobile, powerful weapons with empty fuel tanks. A new form of warfare had taken shape. Control of the Pacific was no longer determined by who ruled the waves, but by who ruled the air above them. The decisive battles were invisible from the horizon, fought at altitude, measured not in tonnage sunk during a single day, but in shortages that spread quietly through an empire. And as Japan struggled to understand how its strength was evaporating without a great naval defeat, American planners were already preparing to refine the method that made it possible. For Japan, shipping was not merely a function of war, it was the war. An island nation stretched across thousands of miles, Japan depended on merchant vessels to bind its empire together. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, iron ore from Southeast Asia, food for civilians, ammunition for soldiers, all of it moved by sea. Without these routes, factories would fall silent, fleets would remain idle, and armies would wither far from home. What shocked Japanese planners was not the idea of attack, but the method. The Allies did not seek a decisive naval confrontation to sever these lifelines. Instead, they turned to the air. From distant island airfields, American aircraft began flying long, methodical missions over open water. They hunted freighters, tankers, and transports with an efficiency that defied traditional expectations of naval warfare. Ships were destroyed far from headlines, far from witnesses, often without warning. The irony was unmistakable. Japan still possessed a formidable fleet, its battleships and cruisers largely intact. Yet these symbols of power were ill-suited to defend the vast web of merchant routes that sustained the empire. Warships could not be everywhere at once. Aircraft could. Bombers crossed distances that surface escorts could not cover, appearing suddenly, striking decisively, and vanishing before retaliation was possible. Japanese naval forces struggled to respond. Escort ships were too few. Radar coverage was limited. Air patrols lacked range and coordination. Each convoy demanded protection, yet the ocean offered no walls, no trenches, no safe corridors. Losses mounted quietly. One tanker sunk meant dozens of aircraft grounded weeks later. One freighter destroyed meant factories slowing months afterward. The consequences unfolded slowly, then all at once. By 1944, the truth was unavoidable. Air power had become a weapon not just of destruction, but of denial. It denied fuel, denied movement, denied time. The blockade was real, yet unseen, silent, methodical, and devastating. Japan was not being strangled at the docks or in its harbors, but in the empty spaces between them. And as this realization settled over Tokyo, American planners were already preparing the next evolution of the air campaign, one that would no longer target what Japan moved, but what it built. By late 1943, the damage was no longer theoretical. Japanese shipping losses were reshaping the war itself. Oil deliveries fell sharply. Raw materials arrived late or not at all. Entire convoys vanished before reaching port. What had begun as scattered air attacks was now forcing a reckoning. Japan's strategy, built around decisive naval power, was being undermined by an enemy that rarely sought the fleet at all. The prevailing belief within Japanese high command remained stubbornly intact. Naval strength, they argued, had always been the ultimate guarantor of security. Battleships, cruisers, and carriers were expected to shield merchant traffic, to deter attack through presence alone. The sea had always been the decisive arena, and Japan had invested decades preparing to dominate it. The sky, by contrast, was still seen as a supporting domain, important but secondary. The irony lay in what the Allies had learned. Armed with long-range bombers, improved navigation, and increasingly precise intelligence, they bypassed the symbols of power and struck at function instead. American aircrews did not seek glory in fleet engagements. They sought tankers, freighters, transports. Each aircraft carried the reach of a naval task force, without its vulnerability. Each successful sortie weakened Japan in ways no single battle ever could. Japan struggled to adapt. Strategic thinking lagged behind events. Resources remained concentrated on preserving the fleet, even as fuel shortages limited its ability to sail. Air defenses were fragmented. Fighter coverage was inconsistent. Radar networks were incomplete. The threat from above was acknowledged, but never fully prioritized. Confidence in naval tradition dulled the urgency of reform. What emerged from this imbalance was a lesson written in absence rather than explosion. Ships that never arrived. Squadrons grounded for lack of fuel. Factories slowed not by bombing, but by scarcity. The Allies had demonstrated that supremacy at sea meant little without control of the air above it. By the time this truth was fully understood in Tokyo, the shift was irreversible. The battle for the Pacific was no longer about fleets maneuvering across open water. It was about who could see farther, strike farther, and deny the enemy the ability to move at all. And as Japan struggled to protect what remained of its supply lines, a far more devastating phase of the air war was already taking shape. From the outset of the Pacific War, Japan's ambitions rested on movement. Resources captured across Southeast Asia were valuable only if they could be transported home. Oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, food from occupied territories, all of it had to cross vast stretches of ocean to sustain factories, fleets, and cities. Secure shipping routes were not a supporting element of Japan's strategy. They were its foundation. The shock came not as a single blow, but as an accumulation. American air power began to reach deeper into Japan's maritime arteries, striking merchant vessels with growing precision. Tankers burned miles from land. Freighters slipped beneath the surface without escort or rescue. Unlike naval battles, these losses did not dominate headlines. They were recorded quietly, logged in manifests and shipping tallies. Yet their effect was cumulative and severe. The irony was cruel. Japan had invested heavily in capital ships, symbols of dominance, meant to decide a great naval climax. But these vessels were poorly suited to defending thousands of miles of vulnerable sea lanes. Air power exposed this imbalance. Bombers could patrol expanses that escorts could not. Intelligence and reconnaissance identified targets faster than surface forces could respond. Japan's faith in its navy blinded it to the changing nature of vulnerability. As shipping losses mounted, the consequences spread far beyond the docks. Oil shortages, grounded aircraft, and immobilized warships. Factories slowed as raw materials failed to arrive. Civilian rationing tightened. Military planners were forced to choose which units would receive fuel and which would wait. Each decision revealed a deeper truth. The empire's strength was hollowing from within, starved not by invasion, but by absence. The struggle to reverse this decline proved futile. Shipbuilding could not replace losses fast enough. Escort vessels were scarce. Training suffered. Crews sailed with the knowledge that protection was limited and detection unreliable. The ocean, once viewed as Japan's shield, had become an open trap. Every voyage carried risk. Every successful delivery felt temporary. In time, the pattern became unmistakable. Japan was facing a blockade in all but name one, enforced not by lines of ships, but by aircraft and intelligence. This silent blockade weakened the war effort without spectacle, draining strength quietly, relentlessly. It required no declaration, no armistice, only persistence. By the time Japan's leaders fully grasped the scale of the collapse, the damage was already embedded in daily life and military reality. The shipping network that had sustained empire was breaking apart. And as Japan struggled to hold together what remained of its supply lines, American air planners were preparing to turn their attention from the sea routes below to the cities and industries that depended on them. The shock was not in the decision to attack, but in its persistence. By 1943, the United States committed itself to a sustained air campaign aimed not at Japan's fleet, but at the vessels that sustained it. Merchant ships, cargo carriers, oil tankers, these became the primary targets. American aircraft began appearing with regularity over shipping lanes once considered distant and secure. The attacks were methodical, unrelenting, and increasingly precise. Japan's leadership clung to a familiar belief. Naval superiority, they assumed, would continue to shield the merchant fleet. The presence of powerful warships was expected to deter interference, as it had in earlier conflicts. The fleet remained the centerpiece of strategy, the visible expression of strength. What could not be seen aircraft flying thousands of miles from improvised island airfields was underestimated. The irony soon became impossible to ignore. Bombing raids from above achieved results no naval engagement ever had. A single successful strike could eliminate fuel destined for dozens of warships or aircraft squadrons. These were not dramatic confrontations measured in salvos exchanged, but quiet losses measured in shortages. The destruction of logistics proved more decisive than the destruction of fleets. Japan's strength was not being confronted. It was being bypassed. The Allies refined their approach with careful intent. Intelligence identified choke points along Japan's supply routes. Tankers were prioritized over freighters. Routes were mapped, patterns studied, vulnerabilities exposed. Aircraft attacked at altitudes and angles that reduced risk while maximizing damage. What began as harassment evolved into a calculated system of denial. Every sunk vessel amplified the effect of the next. For Japan, the struggle was increasingly uneven. Defensive measures lagged behind Allied innovation. Escorts were too few. Air cover was inconsistent. The vastness of the Pacific favored the attacker with reach rather than the defender tied to routes. Each loss forced difficult decisions: where to send fuel, which units to supply, which operations to postpone. The margin for error vanished. Gradually, the momentum of the war shifted. Air power was no longer auxiliary, it was decisive. Control of the skies translated directly into control of movement, production, and time. The campaign demonstrated that an enemy could be weakened without ever facing its main strength directly. What began as an experiment in targeting logistics became a model for modern warfare. Japan's empire, once sustained by constant motion, was slowing under the weight of interrupted supply. And as American air crews perfected the art of denying Japan its lifelines at sea, attention began to turn toward targets that lay even farther inland, where the consequences of air power would be felt not in shortages, but in ash and silence. For Japanese planners, the scale of their shipping network was both a strength and a responsibility. Thousands of miles of ocean connected distant ports, colonies, and battlefronts. Protecting these routes was seen as paramount. As long as supplies moved, the war could continue. The vastness of the Pacific itself was assumed to be a form of defense too large, too empty, too complex to be controlled by any single enemy effort. The shock came as the Allies adjusted their focus with deliberate clarity. Air operations were no longer incidental to naval strategy. They became its center. American forces began concentrating on the destruction of shipping itself, refining aerial tactics designed specifically for maritime targets. Low-level bombing runs, skip bombing techniques, and coordinated strikes transformed aircraft into precise tools of interdiction. The ocean, once a shield, became an exposed corridor. The irony was unmistakable. What earlier generations of officers had envisioned as a decisive contest between fleets was now unfolding almost entirely above the waves. Battleships and cruisers waited for engagements that never came, while aircraft quietly dismantled the infrastructure of war. Control of the sea was being decided without sea battles. The decisive force was no longer mass steel, but reach, timing, and intelligence. Japan struggled to respond effectively. Countermeasures lagged behind innovation. Convoys adjusted routes, sailed at night, or dispersed in hopes of survival. Yet these adaptations only slowed the inevitable. Allied air crews improved coordination, learned enemy patterns, and exploited weaknesses. Each successful strike informed the next. The learning curve favored the attacker, and the cost of failure fell disproportionately on the defender. Losses mounted along vital routes. Oil tankers were hit before reaching refineries. Ammunition shipments failed to arrive at forward bases. Food shortages followed fuel shortages, and morale declined alongside material capacity. Japan's naval forces, still formidable on paper, found themselves constrained by what they could no longer move. Power existed, but it could not be applied. The revelation emerging from these operations was broader than any single campaign. The war was becoming a contest of systems rather than singular battles. Logistics, often invisible to the public, proved as decisive as courage or firepower. The side that could deny movement, supply, and replacement held an advantage that no heroic engagement could reverse. By the time this truth was fully acknowledged, Japan's shipping lanes were already fractured. The air above the Pacific had become a battlefield in its own right, one that determined outcomes far beyond the horizon. And as Allied planners absorbed the lessons of this success, they began to ask a more consequential question. If air power could dismantle an empire's supply lines, what else could it dismantle next? By 1944, the Japanese merchant fleet was fighting for survival. There were no front lines, no clear moments of engagement, only routes that grew more dangerous with every voyage. Precision airstrikes struck with an efficiency that left little room for adaptation. Ships were located, tracked, and attacked with a regularity that transformed the open ocean into a hostile environment. Sinkings increased month by month, not as sudden catastrophes, but as an unbroken sequence of losses. The struggle was unequal. Merchant crews sailed knowing that detection often meant destruction. Many vessels lacked adequate escort. Others sailed without air cover entirely. Bombers arrived low and fast, exploiting weak defenses and predictable routes. A single strike could ignite fuel, tear open hulls, or disable engines beyond repair. Survivors were often left adrift, unseen and unrecorded. The war left little trace except gaps in shipping schedules and numbers on balance sheets. The irony was stark. Newspapers and official communiques continued to focus on naval engagements, carrier battles, surface clashes, the movement of fleets. These events captured attention and defined public understanding of the war at sea. Yet beneath this narrative, a quieter conflict was unfolding. The decisive struggle was not being fought ship against ship, but aircraft against infrastructure. The skies, not the waves, had become the decisive arena. As the attacks continued, pressure mounted across every level of Japan's war effort. Troop movements slowed. Reinforcements failed to arrive. Garrisons became isolated, not through encirclement, but through absence. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and immobilized warships. Supplies that once flowed routinely now arrived sporadically, if at all. Planning became reactive. Decisions were shaped by what could no longer be moved, rather than by what could be achieved. The cumulative effect was corrosive. Each loss reduced capacity, but also confidence. Convoys sailed less frequently. Routes were shortened or abandoned. Ships waited in port for fuel that never came, or escorts that could not be spared. Time itself became an enemy. Delays compounded shortages. Shortages compounded vulnerability. The system weakened from within. What made this campaign so devastating was its invisibility. There was no single battle to mark its success, no dramatic turning point to announce its impact. The results appeared gradually. Factories slowing, units undersupplied, cities tightening, rationing. The war effort bent under pressures that were difficult to trace to a single cause, yet impossible to ignore. The revelation, when it became undeniable, was profound. An empire could be crippled without its fleet being destroyed. Control of supply mattered as much as control of territory. The Allies had reshaped the trajectory of the war not by confronting Japan's strength directly, but by rendering it unusable. Power still existed on paper, but it could no longer be sustained. By the time Japan's leadership fully understood the scale of the damage, the merchant fleet was already shattered. The sea lanes that once connected empire to homeland had become corridors of loss. The war at sea had been fought, and largely decided, without spectacle. And as this silent campaign reached its peak, the logic behind it began to point toward an even more consequential question. If air power could dismantle Japan's ability to move, what would happen when it turned its full attention to the places where Japan lived, worked, and endured? The shock came when the pattern revealed its purpose. Allied air crews were no longer striking shipping at random or even by convenience. They were hunting oil. Tankers became priority targets, tracked across thousands of miles of open water. When they burned, the consequences extended far beyond the loss of a single vessel. One successful strike could remove weeks of fuel from Japan's war economy, setting off a chain reaction that no emergency measure could easily reverse. Japan had long believed its access to oil seized in the early victories of the Pacific War was secure. The southern resource zones promised abundance. Shipping routes, though long, were assumed manageable under the protection of naval power. As long as tankers sailed, Japan believed its fleets would steam, its aircraft would fly, and its factories would function. Oil was treated as a constant, not a vulnerability. The irony was devastating. By targeting tankers rather than warships, the Allies struck at the one resource Japan could not replace. Battleships without fuel were inert. Aircraft without aviation gasoline were grounded. Training schedules were cut. Patrols shortened. Entire fleets remained in harbor, preserved but powerless. Oil did not merely enable combat, it enabled decision-making. Without it, strategy itself collapsed. Japan struggled to respond. Tankers were rerouted, sailed at night, or dispersed to reduce losses. None of it solved the underlying problem. Escorts were insufficient. Air cover was limited by the very fuel shortages the attacks created. Each attempt to protect the oil supply consumed more of the resource already in deficit. The system fed on itself, accelerating decline. The effects reached far beyond the military. Civilian fuel rationing tightened. Transportation slowed. Electricity production faltered. Factories reduced output not from bombing damage, but from lack of energy. The distinction between front line and home front blurred. Shortages experienced in distant waters reshaped daily life in Japanese cities. The war became quieter, colder, and increasingly immobile. What made this collapse so difficult to arrest was its invisibility. There was no single disaster to explain it, no decisive defeat to rally against. Instead, Japan faced a steady erosion of capacity. Ships arrived half-empty or not at all. Units received fuel allocations that allowed movement, but not maneuver. Commanders were forced to plan operations around scarcity rather than opportunity. The revelation, when it was fully understood, reframed the war itself. Air attacks on shipping lanes, especially oil transport, proved to be among the most decisive actions of the conflict. They achieved what no fleet engagement had: the paralysis of an enemy without direct confrontation. Japan's ability to fight eroded not through overwhelming firepower, but through the denial of what sustained firepower in the first place. By late 1944, the results were unmistakable. Japan still possessed ships, aircraft, and trained personnel. But it lacked the fuel to use them effectively. The empire's reach contracted inward, constrained by empty tanks and silent engines. The battle for oil had been fought and largely won without ceremony. And as Japan faced the reality of a war it could no longer fuel, Allied planners began to confront a final question: if air power could strip an empire of movement, how much more could it strip away when directed at the heart of production itself? By the final year of the conflict, Japan's maritime supply routes had narrowed into fragile corridors of uncertainty. Each disruption reduced not only capacity, but long-term resilience. Routes that once carried steady flows of fuel, food, and materials now operated irregularly, if at all. Recovery margins disappeared. The system came under sustained strain and began to fracture. The effects unfolded gradually. Merchant traffic moved with fewer escorts and reduced loads. Departures were delayed for extended periods, often waiting for support that rarely arrived. When vessels did sail, they frequently returned partially supplied or failed to complete their journeys. Institutional pressure appeared first, followed closely by strain on daily civilian life. Distribution tightened. Transportation slowed. The demands of survival began to compete with strategic planning. The imbalance stemmed from structural priorities. Resources had been prepared for decisive surface engagements, emphasizing visibility and direct confrontation. Meanwhile, gaps in logistics and infrastructure were quietly exploited. The decisive impact came not through symbolic targets, but through the systems that sustained movement and continuity. As this pressure continued, the consequences multiplied. Isolated outposts were left unsupported. Aircraft operations were reduced to preserve limited resources. Ships remained docked, not for lack of personnel or equipment, But for lack of essential inputs, strategic options narrowed. Decisions became shaped less by ambition than by constraint. Over time, the logic of the conflict shifted. Control of transport networks translated into control of time, distance, and endurance. Losses accumulated faster than replacements could be arranged. Gaps widened. What was lost in a single day could not be restored for months. For those within the empire, the consequences became increasingly personal. Shortages altered, daily routines, public transportation faltered, industrial schedules contracted. Absence became more noticeable than announcements. The conflict was no longer measured by visible events alone, but by what failed to arrive. The breakdown of logistics transformed the struggle inward. The conclusion became unavoidable. Modern warfare was not determined solely by moments of confrontation, but by the ability to sustain effort over time. When that ability dissolved, outcomes followed gradually, rather than suddenly. By the time this reality was fully acknowledged, the connective network binding the empire had already weakened beyond repair. The capacity to continue diminished day by day, narrowing the path ahead toward a final phase shaped by limits rather than expansion. The shock was not delivered in a single moment, but in the realization that an entire system had been overtaken. By 1944, the Allies were dominating Japan's supply lines in a manner no naval battle had ever achieved. There were no decisive salvos exchanged between fleets, no dramatic surrender at sea. Instead, the outcome was written in absence in empty harbors, stalled factories, and fleets that could no longer sail with purpose. Japan's war effort was being undone quietly, methodically, from above. Yet belief lingered within Japanese leadership. Traditional naval doctrine still shaped thinking, still framed expectations. The decisive battle fleet against fleet remained a powerful idea, reinforced by decades of planning and identity. Resources continued to be allocated toward preserving ships and preparing for confrontations that never came. Meanwhile, the Allies showed little interest in validating that belief. They bypassed it entirely. The irony was striking. The Japanese Navy, once the embodiment of imperial strength, remained largely intact on paper. Battleships and cruisers still floated. Crews still trained. Flags still flew. But power unused is power diminished. Without fuel, without supplies, without freedom of movement, the fleet became symbolic rather than decisive. The real contest was unfolding elsewhere above the sea lanes, across the logistics networks that sustained every operation. The turning point came when the cumulative effect of the air campaign could no longer be ignored. Allied aircraft had achieved what surface warfare could not, the systematic paralysis of an enemy nation. By crippling Japan's shipping network, they severed the connection between resource and battlefield, between factory and front line. Each sunk tanker, each destroyed freighter, narrowed Japan's strategic options until only defensive endurance remained. This approach proved devastatingly efficient. It required no occupation of territory, no costly fleet engagements, no dramatic breakthroughs. It relied instead on reach, intelligence, and persistence. The Allies did not seek to destroy Japan's strength directly. They rendered it unsustainable. The distinction was subtle, but decisive. As air campaigns expanded and refined, naval confrontations receded in importance. The war's center of gravity shifted. Control of the air dictated control of movement, production, and time. Decisions were no longer driven by who could bring the most ships to battle, but by who could deny the enemy the means to fight at all. Air power had moved from supporting role to strategic arbiter. For Japan, the consequences were inescapable. Military units faced chronic shortages, training suffered, operations were delayed or abandoned, civilian life grew harsher as resources failed to arrive. The war effort contracted inward, defined by scarcity rather than ambition. Even without a final naval defeat, the capacity to continue meaningful resistance eroded steadily. The revelation reshaped modern warfare. The Pacific War demonstrated that victory need not come through dramatic confrontation alone. It could emerge through the collapse of systems, through the slow, relentless denial of logistics. Air supremacy, when applied with strategic clarity, could decide wars long before armies or fleets met in decisive battle. By the time Japan confronted this reality, the outcome was already set in motion. The Allies had secured a strategic victory not by breaking the enemy's sword, but by ensuring it could no longer be lifted. The Pacific War had shifted irreversibly, its direction determined less by the clash of fleets than by the quiet dominance of the skies. And as this new logic of warfare settled over the conflict, it carried with it a final implication, one that would soon confront the world with the full and unsettling reach of air power's consequences. As the airstrikes continued into the final stages of the war, Japan's struggle to resupply its military and civilian population grew steadily more severe. What had once been a complex but functioning maritime system now operated in fragments. Ships sailed less frequently. Cargoes shrank. Deliveries that had once been routine became uncertain gambles. Each successful attack deepened the imbalance between what Japan needed and what it could deliver. The pressure was relentless. Military units in the field experienced chronic shortages of fuel and ammunition. Training flights were curtailed to conserve aviation gasoline. Naval vessels remained in harbor, fully armed but unable to maneuver. On the home front, civilians felt the consequences in more immediate ways. Food rations tightened, transportation faltered, and industry slowed. The war's burden shifted inward, reshaping daily life through absence rather than bombardment. The irony lay in the contrast between appearance and reality. Japan's naval fleet, though still formidable in composition, could not fulfill its intended role. Battleships and cruisers were designed to fight other warships, not to shield thousands of miles of merchant traffic from constant aerial assault. The ocean offered no shelter from aircraft that could strike beyond the reach of escorts and vanish before effective response. Naval power, concentrated and visible, proved ill-suited to a dispersed logistical war. As losses mounted, improvisation replaced planning. Convoys were reduced in size. Routes were altered repeatedly in hopes of avoiding detection. Ships sailed at night or hugged coastlines, increasing the risk of accidents and delays. None of these measures addressed the underlying imbalance. Each adaptation consumed time, fuel, and resources Japan could no longer spare. The shipping network contracted further with every attempt to preserve it. The turning point was subtle but decisive. The final stages of the war were no longer defined by the possibility of a great naval engagement. They were defined by attrition from the air. Lifelines were cut one by one, not through dramatic confrontation, but through persistent denial. The Pacific became a battlefield, measured in missed deliveries and immobilized units, rather than sunk battleships. For the Allies, the logic of the campaign was clear. Air power offered reach, flexibility, and efficiency. It allowed them to strike where Japan was weakest, while avoiding the costs of direct fleet engagement. Each destroyed vessel reduced Japan's capacity to resist without requiring territorial conquest. The effect was cumulative, accelerating collapse without a single decisive blow. The revelation was unavoidable. The unrelenting air campaign against Japan's shipping was not a supporting effort, it was central to the war's outcome. It eroded Japan's ability to fight, to produce, and to sustain its population. By the time the full scale of the crisis was understood, the damage was irreversible. Systems that take years to build can collapse in months when their foundations are removed. By the war's final months, Japan faced a reality shaped less by battlefield defeat than by systemic failure. The capacity to move resources, reinforce positions, and maintain industry had largely vanished. The empire's reach had contracted to its shores. And as Japan confronted the consequences of a war it could no longer sustain, Allied planners prepared to apply the same logic of air power to targets even closer to home, where the final chapters of the conflict would be written not on the sea, but over the cities themselves. By 1945, the scale of Japan's predicament could no longer be concealed by rhetoric or resolve. The empire was incapable of sustaining its war effort, not because its armies had been annihilated or its fleet spectacularly destroyed, but because the mechanisms that supported them had ceased to function. Shipping lanes lay fractured. Fuel was scarce. Movement itself had become a liability. The war had reached a stage where continuation depended not on courage or sacrifice, but on systems that no longer existed. The shock was not sudden. It was cumulative. Japan still possessed aircraft, ships, and trained personnel, yet these assets increasingly sat idle. Engines were preserved rather than run. Training was shortened or abandoned. Operations were planned cautiously, often postponed indefinitely. The absence of supply dictated every decision. The war effort was no longer advancing. It was conserving what little remained. The irony was unmistakable. For generations, naval power had defined Japan's strategic identity. control of the sea had been seen as the ultimate measure of security. Yet the final blows of the war were not struck by fleets meeting on open water. They were delivered from the air. Air superiority, once considered a supporting element, had become the decisive instrument. The skies, not the sea, determined the outcome. With Japan's supply chains crippled, the Allies gained a freedom of action that reshaped the conflict's final phase. Aircraft could strike Japanese-held territories with increasing frequency and reach. Defenses weakened by fuel shortages and material scarcity struggled to respond. The absence of mobility left Japan reactive, its options narrowing with each passing week. What resistance remained was constrained by what could no longer be moved or replaced. The turning point was complete. The Allies no longer faced a nation capable of sustained war. They faced one enduring under collapse. Air campaigns extended deeper, encountering less opposition and inflicting greater cumulative damage. The logic of the earlier shipping campaign now applied on a broader scale. Denial of supply had created vulnerability. Vulnerability invited further pressure. For those within Japan, the consequences were inescapable. Civilian hardship intensified. Transportation faltered. Production slowed further. The distinction between battlefield and homeland dissolved under the weight of scarcity. The war's presence was no longer defined solely by attack, but by exhaustion. A society built for expansion now struggled simply to endure. The revelation of this campaign lay in its restraint as much as its effect. The Allies had demonstrated that an empire could be brought to the brink without a climactic confrontation. The destruction of shipping, quiet, methodical, and persistent, had achieved what decades of naval theory had not anticipated. It rendered power unusable. It reshaped the tempo of war. It shifted victory from spectacle to inevitability. By the time Japan stood on the edge of collapse, the cause was clear. The campaign fought above the waves had dismantled the foundation of resistance. Ships without fuel, aircraft without range, forces without supply. The machinery of war had seized up, not through dramatic defeat, but through systematic denial. The victory in the skies was not merely tactical or operational, it was conceptual. It revealed a new reality of modern warfare, where control of logistics and airspace could decide outcomes long before final blows were struck. The Pacific War's ending was shaped as much by what could not move as by what could. And as the war entered its final, irreversible moments, the silence left by empty sea lanes and grounded fleets spoke more clearly than any declaration the empire had already fallen. Long before the last chapter was written, the consequence of Japan's failure to protect its shipping lanes was not immediate defeat, but gradual collapse. The empire did not fall in a single day or through a final decisive battle. Instead, its war effort eroded piece by piece as the mechanisms that sustained it ceased to function. Naval strength remained visible, impressive even, yet increasingly irrelevant. Power that could not be supplied could not be exercised. This collapse unfolded largely out of sight. There were no great armadas converging on the horizon, no climactic exchanges of gunfire to mark the moment. The most important battles of the Pacific War were being fought beyond view, high above the ocean, where aircraft patrolled invisible routes and struck targets that rarely made headlines. The war's decisive arena was not the sea itself, but the airspace above it. The irony was profound. For centuries, maritime power had defined empire. Fleets symbolized reach, security, and dominance. Japan had embraced this tradition fully, investing enormous resources into ships designed to fight other ships. Yet this very focus obscured a vulnerability. While attention remained fixed on naval strength, the Allies dismantled the systems that allowed that strength to function. The battle was not against the fleet, but against what fed it. Air crews flew missions that lacked spectacle but carried immense consequence. They hunted tankers, freighters, and transports targets, unremarkable in appearance, but essential in purpose. Each successful strike removed fuel, food, or materials from circulation. Each loss narrowed Japan's options. The cumulative effect of these missions reshaped the war without announcing itself. As the campaign progressed, the distinction between military and civilian impact dissolved. Shortages reached factories and households alike. Transportation slowed. Production faltered. The war's presence was felt not only through attacks, but through absence, through what could no longer be delivered. The unseen war reached into daily life, altering routines and expectations. The revelation was not simply that air power mattered, but how it mattered. The Allies' air campaign demonstrated that modern warfare could be decided by denying an enemy the ability to sustain itself. Logistics became the battlefield. Air superiority became the means. The glamour of naval engagement gave way to the discipline of persistence. Victory emerged from endurance rather than spectacle. By the time Japan confronted this reality, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The war effort had been hollowed out. Ships remained, but they could not sail freely. Aircraft existed, but they lacked fuel and range. Commanders planned operations constrained by scarcity. The empire's strength had been rendered unusable. This unseen war reshaped the Pacific conflict's meaning. It revealed that the most decisive actions are not always the most visible. History often remembers battles by their noise and drama. Yet here, the war was decided by quieter measures, by tonnage lost, routes severed, and systems denied. As the Pacific War drew toward its conclusion, the legacy of this campaign became clear. Japan's defeat was not sealed by a final naval clash, but by a sustained effort that dismantled the foundations of resistance. The air war over the seas had done its work long before the final moments arrived. And in that silence, where fleets once sailed and supplies once flowed, the true shape of modern war was revealed, defined not by the battles it announces, but by the systems it quietly removes. The human element of the air campaign often remained distant from public view, yet it was carried on the shoulders of thousands of airmen who flew long missions over empty ocean with little margin for error. Crews studied charts marked with shipping routes instead of front lines. They memorized silhouettes of tankers and freighters rather than enemy formations. For many, the war was not a clash of fleets, but hours of monotony broken by moments of sudden violence far from land. These airmen rarely spoke in terms of heroism. Their work was methodical, technical, and exhausting. Flights stretched for hundreds of miles over open water where navigation errors could be fatal. Weather was unpredictable. Fuel calculations were unforgiving. A successful mission often ended without witnesses or recognition, its impact measured only later in reduced enemy capacity. The victory was abstract, delayed, and invisible. Strategists understood the stakes more clearly than most. They knew that each destroyed tanker shortened the war by denying Japan fuel it could not replace. Each freighter sunk weakened an army unit that would never be resupplied. These planners did not seek dramatic battles. They sought certainty. Air power offered a way to apply pressure continuously, turning geography itself into an advantage. Distance, once Japan's shield, became its vulnerability. The irony lay in how these efforts were perceived. Naval battles dominated headlines and memory. They were visible, dramatic, and decisive in appearance. The air campaign against shipping lacked that spectacle. It unfolded quietly, mission by mission, tonnage by tonnage. Yet its results proved far more decisive. The war's outcome was shaped less by celebrated engagements than by the steady denial of movement and supply. For pilots and crews, the moral weight of their work was often realized only in retrospect. They were not confronting enemy soldiers face to face. They were dismantling systems. The destruction they caused was indirect but profound. A bomb dropped on a tanker could ground aircraft hundreds of miles away weeks later. A single successful sortie could ripple outward through factories, fleets, and cities. The distance between action and consequence was vast. As the war drew toward its conclusion, the revelation became unavoidable. The true heroes of the Pacific War were not defined solely by courage under fire, but by endurance, precision, and restraint. These airmen changed the course of history not by overwhelming force in a single moment, but by persistent effort over time. They reshaped warfare by proving that control of the skies could decide conflicts long before armies or fleets reached their limits. Their legacy was not written in monuments to great battles, but in the altered logic of war itself. They demonstrated that modern conflict would be won as much by denying an enemy the ability to fight as by defeating them in combat. The Pacific War became a lesson in systems, logistics, and reach taught by those who flew above the waves. And as history turned its attention to the final moments of the conflict, the contributions of these unseen heroes lingered quietly in the background, present in every grounded ship, every empty fuel tank, and every decision shaped by scarcity, reminding the world that victory had been forged not only at sea, but high above it. In the end, the Pacific War did not conclude with the image Japan had prepared for a final clash of fleets, steel against steel, doctrine fulfilled in fire. Instead, it ended in a quieter reckoning. The Allies did not win the Pacific War with battleships. They won it with bombers. The instruments of victory were not found at the waterline, but thousands of feet above it. This truth emerged slowly, almost reluctantly. For much of the war, military thinking on all sides remained anchored to tradition. Naval power had always been decisive in the Pacific. Ships carried nations, protected trade, projected force. Yet beneath this familiar logic, a new reality took shape. The ability to sustain war, to move fuel, food, men, and material proved more decisive than the ability to destroy an enemy's fleet in a single encounter. Air superiority made that reality unavoidable. By controlling the skies, the Allies gained the ability to see, to reach, and to deny. Bombers did not need to seek out Japan's strongest weapons. They simply rendered those weapons unusable. A battleship without fuel was irrelevant. An air force without gasoline was grounded. An empire without logistics was immobile. The destruction of Japan's shipping network revealed a central lesson of modern warfare. Logistics are not secondary to combat. They are combat. Every tanker sunk shortened the war. Every freighter destroyed removed options from Japan's leadership. These were not dramatic victories, but cumulative ones. They reshaped the conflict by eroding its foundations rather than shattering its symbols. What made this campaign decisive was not only its effectiveness, but its inevitability. Once air superiority was established, Japan could not reverse the imbalance. Shipbuilding could not keep pace with losses. Escort forces were stretched too thin. Defensive measures consumed the very resources they sought to protect. The logic of attrition favored the attacker with reach and intelligence. The outcome became a matter of time. This shift carried a moral weight that lingered beyond the war itself. It forced a reconsideration of how wars are won and how they are remembered. History often elevates moments of spectacle, great battles, dramatic decisions, visible triumphs. Yet the Pacific War demonstrated that the most consequential actions may be the least visible. Victory emerged not from one decisive blow, but from sustained pressure applied with discipline and restraint. Air superiority did not merely support victory, it defined it. It transformed geography from obstacle into weapon. It turned distance into advantage. It allowed the Allies to fight a war of systems rather than symbols. By the time Japan faced its final moments, the outcome had already been decided by empty sea lanes and silent engines. The reflection that remains is sobering. Power is not only measured by what can be destroyed, but by what can be sustained. The Pacific War stands as a reminder that modern conflict is won as much by denial as by domination. The skies became the arena where endurance was tested and broken. In the final accounting, the war's irony is complete. It was a conflict shaped by oceans, fleets, and islands. Yet its decisive battles were fought far above the waves. The ships remained. The sailors endured. But the ability to continue vanished. A war fought at sea, but won in the skies.